This is lesson 4, and what we're doing here is we're putting a puzzle together. And so we're trying to tell a story, and the whole story won't get told until we get maybe to lesson 10 or so. But we're trying to each week piece it together by adding a new thought to it. So the question is how to get God to bless my life. And the overarching theme, we'll stick with that one. And so the first thing that we have to do is recognize that if I want God to bless my life, I have to respect His Word. And that was lesson 1. And the Bible is God's Word. And we made that assertion in lesson number 1. Lesson 2 was creation. And we weren't there, so we don't know how it happened, but we do know why. Because Genesis 1 and 2 gives us a pretty good indication of what God was after when He did all this. And we learned in that lesson that it was all about relationships. Relationship with Him, relationship with each other, relationship with the earth even, and finally relationship with ourselves, meaning just being at peace. And we found that in chapter 1 and 2. Lesson number next was the fall. Because, what happened in the Garden of Eden? God put a tree. And you can't have a relationship if you don't have a choice. So therefore we have this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And by the way, it wasn't the tree of good and evil. It was the knowledge of good and evil. Not evil, just the knowledge of it. And so in Genesis chapter 3, which was last week, we saw what happened when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. And that He only asked for one thing, obey. And how hard can that be? Well, it's hard. You know, all you have to do is tell somebody they can't do something, and that's all they want to do. So here they go. And so we saw in there that, don't kick that stand now, Tim, you're making me nervous. Yeah, all right. So I saw your foot there. I'm looking like that, right? So we saw the very first mention of the Messiah in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when it talked about the seed of woman bruising the serpent's head, you shall bruise his heel. So really what it talks about is a cosmic struggle between good and evil, and between righteousness and sin, between Satan and God. And here we are, we're sort of caught in the middle of all that. And we recognize that God made a provision in that and did not kill them. And the provision was He made a coat of skin for them. And so now we have the very first death that occurred in the Bible. Something had to give up His skin for this. So we know now that there's a sacrifice involved in this reconciliation process. So now we're spinning a web and we're learning some things about how this whole thing, this whole connection is made. And by the way, here's a new thought for you. Did you ever realize this, that God invented death for the human experience? And I think ultimately so that He Himself could experience it. He died for us. So now we have this grand overarching picture of love that's, you can't believe it. But now we've got this, the seed of woman, the serpent's head. So we know in hindsight that that's Jesus. We know about the sacrifice that was made. Well, that's Jesus. So now we're going to look again in Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to talk about the flood of Noah's day, because I think this flood answers some interesting questions, and I think maybe it even asks more questions than it answers. So I'm going to start reading in Genesis chapter 6. And it says, "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." Now, I'm just going to raise a question here, and I'm not going to give much of an answer, because the question is, who are these sons of God and who are these daughters of men? Now, there's two different basic thoughts to this, and I'll tell you what they are, but it doesn't change the story much. One thought is that the sons of God were of the godly line of Seth, a substitute for Abel when Cain killed Abel. He was the next one born, or the next one recorded anyway. So one thought is that these are of that line. And the daughters of men were thought to be the line of Cain. So now we have Cain and Seth and them, these people getting together. Another thought is, and this is, you got to let your imagination go on this one, is that these sons of God are fallen angels. Now we know that there are fallen angels. We certainly know that. But the question is, can they procreate? And it doesn't seem reasonable to me, but I'm not going to close the door. I don't know what's going on here. All I know is there's a big controversy, and everybody that says they have the answer, they're over their head. They're way over their pay grade, in my humble opinion. Okay. And it says in verse 3, "And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for he is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So now we have an interesting time being put on something, a time limit for some reason. And so let's just keep this idea in mind that we have a time limit. And by the way, when did time start? Time started in the Garden of Eden when they fell. Time didn't mean anything prior to the fall, but now, since we have the fall, now we have some scientific principles, one called the second law of thermodynamics, which means that everything tends to wind down. And that didn't happen before the fall. So time, or another way to say that is entropy, is a result of the fall. All right, so now we're sort of under the curse of time. We are certainly bound by time. We are. And we have the parameters of God doesn't, but we're under the boundaries of time. Now it says in verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bare children unto them, and the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Now, what in the world happened here? Who are we talking about? Who are these giants? Is this gargantuan creature? What is this? Are these angels? I don't know. And I don't think we can know, but I do have some thoughts about it. One thought is, and it sort of separates two different thoughts. It says there were giants in the earth in those days. Then there's a semicolon. And also after that, the sons of God came into it. So it looks like we got two different thoughts. We have giants, and then we also have children. So I don't think they're the same because of the way the sentence structure is. So I wonder who these giants were and what is a giant? Well, I don't know what a giant is. You know, maybe Bill Gates is a giant in his way, right? Maybe it's a person of renown for some reason because these were men of renown. Michael Jordan was a giant. He wasn't as big as Wilt Chamberlain, but he was still a giant in what he did. Or maybe it's giants. Maybe it's, and here's another thought you might process, maybe it's dinosaurs. Maybe, and you know, there's no doubt in my mind that there's dinosaurs walk the earth, and maybe they were part of all, I don't know what's going on here. All I know is when we get through with this flood experience, there's no more giants. And maybe that's where the dinosaurs went. We're always wondering where the dinosaurs go, you know, and they want to say, well, this big meteor came and it hit the earth and it killed all the dinosaurs. And I'm just always surprised that it spared the dogs. I mean, somehow there's just a logical problem with that to me. Okay, so I'm saying this to you to say that this raises more questions than it gives answers. And I think that we ought to have questions because one of the things that we fall into these days is the trap of every time a scientist says something, we bite on it. And just because it says he's a scientist, we're supposed to believe everything the scientists say. Now, just for fun, I'll just give you one little scientific heartburn I have. Way back when, they had this, you've seen the chart of human development. You've got the amoeba or the little single cell, and then it gets bigger, and then all of a sudden we got a little thing crawling up out of the water, and then it starts to stand up, and now we got and it's growing legs, and then and now we got a monkey, and then we got something else going on, and we've got a Neanderthal and a Peking man and all these different guys, right? So this is theoretically the evolutionary chain. Well, one of the guys in this chain was called the Peking man. And one of the big problems with this guy is it was a hoax, because they found this tooth about that big, and they built a big skeleton around it and said this is the missing link, because there was a link missing in there. So if we have a missing link, we got to fill it with something. So we're going to make one up. And it turned out to be the tooth of a pig. But they turned it into the Peking man. Now, here's the funny part. Scientifically, 500 doctoral dissertations were written on the Peking man. Then they found out it was a hoax. So should we revoke their doctorates? I'm just thinking, now we got doctor scientists, I think we ought to revoke their doctorates, because it was on a bogus idea to begin with. So I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to talking about science. I think there's good science, and then there's ego science. And ego science and you have to give precise numbers, 640 million years ago, here's what happened. How'd you know it was 640? I mean, why not 639 or 650? How do you know that? And it's not like that. If you want to look intelligent, you have to use precision in your language, and I always get nervous about stuff like that. Okay, never mind that. I'm going off here. But I am interested in these men of renown, because what does it take to be a person of renown? Well, you got to be famous in some way for something, right? And what are you famous for? Well, in my opinion, these guys were ultra smart. One of the questions we can't answer, how did they build the pyramids? Who did that? Where did they get these stones from? How did they cut them? How did they get them up this thing? How in the world? And they're still trying to figure that out, and how long they've been sitting there. But these men of renown knew, because they did it. I think they were smarter than we are. I don't think they have the technology that we have, but I think they were intellectually smarter, because I don't think that God would have made Adam and Eve substandard. I think we have declined, not gotten smarter. Knowledge is increasing, but not intelligence. All right, so there's my crummy opinion. It says, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. Oh my gosh, how can that be? Every thought you have is evil. And the driving force of every thought is evil. Well, so the question to me is, what is the overarching sin? And we have to go back to the Garden of Eden to find that out. And I think Eve committed this sin. She said, why does this have to be about God? Why can't this be about me? So I think the overarching sin, the basis for all sin, is pure selfishness. Just purely self. And if you don't believe it, watch a 2-year-old. If you don't believe it, watch a 13-year-old. If you don't believe it, watch a 30-year-old, If you don't believe, I'm saying here, because it's all about me. I just want my way. And in our society today, if you disagree with my idea, I'm going to punish you, because that's what we do. We punish people. And I'm not allowed to have my own thought process. I got to have yours. And if we don't disagree on that, then all right, never mind. So here it is. Every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And what that simply says is, I want what I want when I want it, and that's all I know. And I don't really care about much else. And that was a continual problem. It says, and it repented the Lord that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and creeping things and fowls of the air, for it repents me that I have made them. And if we're going to get a lesson out of this, I want you to get this lesson. God has his limits. We might push him and push him and push him. We might fall on his grace over and over and over again. We might experience his grace over and over. But at some point, he's got his limits. And that's something not only from a corporate level, but also from a personal level. God has his limits. It says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. I like that now. Now there's an interesting Hebrew word that I don't know very well, but I've heard a lesson on this, and it's kind of interesting that the word Noah in Hebrew looks like this, and the word grace in Hebrew looks like that. So it's just exactly the opposite, which is kind of cool. Noah found grace, and I don't know what to make of that. I just think it's neat. But I do know that when you find something, you probably were seeking it. And I think that here's another lesson for us. We have to go after grace ourselves. We have to seek it ourselves. We can't just hope it catches us one day and slams us with grace. No, I don't think so. I think, in fact, later on we'll see in Scripture that they will find me when they search for me with all their hearts. Remember this Scripture. They will find me when they search for me with all their hearts. Okay. But these are the generations of Noah. It says he was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. I like that. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Now, why would it be violence? Because I want my way. And if I can't have my way, we're going to fight. We're going to have struggles, man. And if I'm stronger than you, I'm going to take what I want. And if I can't get it, I'm going to punish you for not giving it. Violence, 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 violence. And God looked upon the earth. Behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way before the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the ark. And God said, make an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shall you make in the ark. You're going to pitch it within and without with pitch. So here's what we know, that whatever this flood was, number one, it was the judgment of God. And at some point, you can expect the judgment of God in some form, some way, somehow, someday, the judgment of God. And the object is to try to make that as livable as possible. Okay, so every time we turn around now, and let's just follow some of these facts on the fact sheet here. Oh, and I want to read the introduction. It's a little bit late, but I'm going to read it anyway. It says, by paying particular attention to the flood of Noah's day, one can learn many lessons about the character of God. That's what I want to know. I want to know how God operates. I mean, if I want him to bless me, I got to know what he's expecting. I can't just hope I get this right and just get lucky. It's not a roll of the dice. I want to know God, and I want to know what he's thinking. And it says lesson. And by the way, I think that every person on the planet maybe should have that kind of a mindset. What is God doing? What's this whole thing all about? It says lessons about Jesus are ever increasing. And then I want to introduce a term, progressive revelation prevails. And when I say progressive revelation, here's what that means. We learn a little bit. Then we learn a little bit more. Then we learn a little bit more. Then after a while, we get a clearer picture of who this is and what he's like and what we need to know about him. And then it says, watch for the type of Christ. And we're going to see that when we get down to the end here. Now, here's some facts. Number one, it had never rained before. Genesis 2 and verse 6, it says that the earth was watered by a mist that went up. It wasn't rain, it was a mist that went up. So we know that this was sort of a hothouse effect. And one of the things that does scientifically is it destroys the idea, or certainly hinders the idea, that the radiation from the sun has always hit the earth at the same rate, which messes up carbon-14 dating. And so there goes one of your scientific principles, because science shouldn't assume things, and that's one of their assumptions. But that just wasn't the case. Next here, it says, this is the judgment of God. We've already discussed that. It says, Noah obeyed God. So every time, and by the way, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, that's all he ever wanted. Was obedience. Just obey him. And not because he's an egomaniac and power mad and power hungry, because if you obey God, you're going to live better. You're going to live under the spout where the glory pours out. And what's wrong with that? Okay. So every time we see Noah interacting with God here, it says, and Noah did all that God commanded him to do in verse 7, or chapter 7:5, and Noah did according to all that God commanded him. So every time we turn around, Noah is obeying God. That's a good practice. Noah got blessed, would you say? You want to be blessed? Obey God. That's what I'm telling you here. Okay. Here we also know that God gave everyone a chance. In verse 4, I'm in chapter 7, and here's what it says. For yet, this is God talking, for 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. Now, remember what happened? He said 120 years. Now we got it down to 7 days. So he's not keeping any secrets here. And we know that every person had a chance to repent himself of the way he was living, and to turn over the idea that it's all about me. Maybe I should be paying attention to God. And, we just monkey around with this like it's Russian roulette. That's a risky way to live our lives. And now we have a countdown starting. And why would he give the countdown if he wasn't giving a way out? He's giving a countdown. And so now I'm looking in verse 9. Let's keep reading. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. Now, wow, that's old, man. How did he get what was going on back then? Well, if we have a hothouse effect, things grow bigger, last longer. That's one issue. We also know that it was an oxygen-rich environment, because that's what a hothouse does. We also know that there was not yet something that we would call genetic loading. And one of the things that we have is in our lives is we catch a disease, we catch another one, we catch another one, we get all this stuff going on in our bodies, and after a while we cross-reference with people, and we cross our gene pools, and before you know it, we're corrupt, and we're physically corrupt. And back in those days, that hadn't happened yet. It says, Noah went in, verse 7, and his sons and his sons' wives with him into the ark because of the waters of the flood, and we got beasts going in, etc., etc. And verse number 9, it says, there went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah. So now we've got this animals being spared. So they are, and I think the earth is for people. And so why are the animals being spared? Not just to give animals rights, but because people have rights. And people are going to eat animals. And this sort of procreates everything. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. Now, in verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, in the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. So we've got two things going on here. We've got this colossal, all the fountains of the pushing up like that. I mean, maybe that's where the mountains came from. Maybe it was flat before that. And all these volcanoes exploding and erupting and blah, and creating all this. And then it also says, and the windows of heaven were open. So now we got water crashing down and the earth upheaval. And what in the world would cause such a thing? And, well, I do know that there's one thing that might cause it physically. And there's a law, and I forgot the name of the law. It was Doyle or Boyle or somebody like that law. And I looked this up one day. I memorized it, but then I forgot. And the way it works is when two celestial bodies over a certain size approach each other because of their gravitational forces, they will not collide. They will instead, the smaller of the two will explode and be drawn to the poles of the other one. Instant something happened, And there's a very interesting book on this. You can actually Google this if you want and read the book itself. It's called The Genesis Flood and the Ice Epic. And very interesting, and lots of science going on in there, scientific discussions about that possibility. Now, here's what we do know. We do know that in Antarctica, that they found these herds of mastodons in Antarctica, vegetarians that were frozen, instantly frozen. And what happened to it? Says that in history says that they even had vegetation still in their mouths. So whatever happened was instantaneous. So here they are now, all these quick frozen mammoths, didn't even have time to swallow, and now we have ice on the poles. And we didn't have that before. There was vegetation there, or they wouldn't have had stuff in their mouths, right? So that's kind of interesting to me. And can we explain that? Maybe this celestial body thing explains it. I don't know. All I know is that it creates more questions than it does give answers. So we have this colossal catastrophe that took place. Now in verse number 12, it says, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, you know what happens every year in our country around springtime, the Mississippi overflows. Because we get a few days of rain, oh my gosh, now what's going to happen? And it overflows its banks. What if you had 40 days and 40 nights of crashing down water? What would happen? I mean, well, I know what would happen. It's going to flood. And that's kind of an interesting notion. Now, if you look in verse 19 of the same chapter, it says, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. And by the way, every ancient civilization has a flood story. Everybody talks about what happened in the flood. Even American Indians, whatever they were called back then, had flood stories. So every civilization. And if you don't know how high they were covered, verse 20 says, 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. So it even gives a measurement. That's pretty precise. 15 cubits, and a cubit is 18 inches, so 15 of those above the highest hill. That's how deep the water was. Now, I was watching a Nat Geo the other day, and I do this because sometimes it looks interesting and sometimes it makes me mad. And some of the stupid stuff they deal with, it just makes me crazy. But one of the people said, we found this, what's at Mount Everest? They had divided Mount Everest into three parts, thirds and thirds. And they noticed something unusual. On the top third of Mount Everest, there was fossilized marine life. And they said, oh my gosh, now we got to figure out how in the world that got up there. Maybe it's not that complicated, right? And in verse 21 it says, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and cattle and of beast, of every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and every man. Look at that. And all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, and all that was on the dry land died. So this is a catastrophe of monumental proportions. And God sort of cleaned up the earth and cleaned up the sin. And guess what happened? For the longest, for a year anyway, the earth was left sinless. Until, of course, these people got off the boat. Now sin started over again. So here's something we ought to notice now. Look at the system change. As a result of this experience, the system changes. And I'm talking about the ecology. In chapter 6 and verse 3, now we have time limits, 120 years. Before the flood, the average age, by the way, was 850. After the flood, Noah was 120 when he died and was considered really old. So something, I'm sorry, not Noah, but Moses. So something happened between here and here, and it was the flood. Verse 4, giants, where are these giants? And if they were dinosaurs, they became extinct. How about 7/11? And this big colossal explosion and this experience of now this upheaval and rain, because now it's raining. Never did that before. Chapter 8 in verse 22, it says, and while the earth remains, seed time, harvest, cold and heat, summer, winter, day and night shall not cease. So this is a new thing. We have extreme seasons now. We didn't have that before in the hothouse. Okay? 9:2, it says, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the field and upon every fowl of the air. So now animals fear man. They didn't have that before. And now, and the verse 3 tells why. It says, for every moving thing that lives shall be meat for you. So here's the deal. We're going to eat them. That's why they're afraid of us, because now we hunt them and kill them. And 9:13 and 14, and I will set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token on of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass that when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in a rainbow. This is a rainbow. So rainbow, there's nothing big complicated about that. We know how that works. We get moisture in the air, and the sun rays refract, it's called, and they go like that, and it produces this light. It's like a prism. That's very normal, isn't it? But not before the flood. It didn't happen like that before the flood. This is a new thing. And verse, where am I, 13, 14? I'm looking at verse 21 now. It says, this is Noah. He began to be a husbandman. He planted a vineyard, and he drank wine and was drunk. Oh, so what happened here? And I'm thinking to myself, well, what is fermentation, by the way? Well, it's an effect of time, isn't it? We didn't have the effect of time before this. Things live longer. Maybe this is the very first time something fermented. Could have been, because it's a result of time, right? Okay, now, and so I'm giving him the benefit and saying he didn't mean to get drunk. He just did, He's a good guy. Now I'm looking in 2 Peter chapter 3, and I'm going into the New Testament, and there's a very big point I want to make. And this is regarding the second coming of Jesus. And there's scoffers, it says in verse 3. And verse 4 says, and here's what they say, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. So they're saying, come on now, there's nothing different since the creation started. It says, but for this, they willingly are ignorant. And I'm telling you this, there's a lot of that going around. Willing ignorance. It's ignorant because I don't want to know. I choose not to know. I think if you try to find out, you'll find the truth. But if you don't want to, okay. And they were willingly ignorant that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, and therefore the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. That's interesting. Because here's what it says in so many words. The world that then was perished. The world that then was isn't the world that now is. It's a different world. From an ecological standpoint, it's a different world. And it helps us to understand that. It answers a million questions about things and time and issues and just to say, well, this is what the scientists... Please. Okay. Now here's some lessons. And from this lesson, number one, there's grace. And I want to say this to you, all of us need grace. And grace means unmerited favor. So we are looking for something that we don't deserve. We're looking for the favor of God. And do we deserve it? No, basically not. We're all pretty much selfish. That's the way we roll. But grace is available, and it comes from God. But you have to seek it, don't you know? Okay. And also mercy. And this is 2 Peter 2 and verse 5. It says that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So when he was building the ark, that was his full-time job. Part-time, he was preaching to the people. So what he did, what do you think he was preaching to the people? What was the nature of his message? Judgment's coming, don't you think? And I want to echo that. Judgment's coming. In chapter 7, we have last chance. So now in verse 9 or verse 4, he's saying 7 days, 7 days. And in verse 9, all of a sudden the animals start coming in. So I'm thinking, what would you do if you were there? What would you do if you saw that? What would you do if you were the people that said, this Noah's a nut? I mean, look what who would build a boat out in the desert? Of course, it probably wasn't desert by that time, right? But who would build, I mean, what's going on here? And one board at a time. By the way, these were smart people. Could you build a boat that big? I mean, with your limited skill and tools and whatever else Noah did. Somehow he managed to do it. But now, here are the animals going in, and they're going, this guy's a nut, but what do you think about this parade of animals? I mean, that's kind of, look at them. They're walking in, following Noah. I mean, we ain't seen that before. I wonder if something's going on here. Maybe they said, Ronnie, what do you think? Think we ought to, I don't know, man. It's kind of weird. Nah, Noah's a nut. I'm not biting on this. This is a trick. This is a trick. He's fooling us some way. You know how human nature is. I want what I want, and I know when I want it now. And I don't care what you're doing or I got my own way. In fact, it says in Isaiah 53, and I read this to you earlier, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. Yep, that's our problem. We all want our own way. And we also know that opportunities end because in chapter 7 and verse number 16, it says, and God closed the door. Noah didn't close the door. God closed the door. So we have to know that there's a limit to all of this. And at some point, God says, the door is shut. Now, here's a question for you. Think about this. Tim, how many of those people, when it started raining, became believers? I think maybe 100%. How many of them were clutching at the boat? How many of them were looking for some way to hang on? How many of them were, every one of them, but God said, where's the faith in that? You see the rain now. There's no faith involved. Besides, your time limit's up. I gave you how many years? 120? Isaiah 55:6 is a cool verse. It says, seek ye the Lord while he may be found and call upon him while he's near. So I'm thinking to myself, there's going to be a time in a person's life when he might be near. There's a time in a person's life when he might not be near. He might just give up on people. And I think that he extends his grace, and then at some point he's out of grace. I'm done here. Now, here's an interesting thing in chapter 6 and verse 14. This is a picture, by the way. The ark itself is a picture of Jesus. Everybody inside was spared the judgment. Everybody outside experienced the judgment. And Jesus, and they went in, anybody that went in the door, and Jesus in the New Testament said, I'm the door. That's John 10. If any man enters in, it's going to enter in by me. So we got a picture now of Jesus. And this cool little word pitch, he says, I want to pitch it within and without. So what is pitch? And the New Testament word for the Old Testament word pitch is the same as the New Testament word for redemption. I want you to smear redemption on this thing. You know, I want you to put redemption on the outside so that the judgment can't get in. And theologically, you're going to put redemption on the inside so that the people in there can't slip out. What a cool picture of salvation. So once you enter in, that's a cool experience. Okay? So this whole thing about the flood, this is spinning the web a little bit more and giving us some more details about how God operates and what He's like and His character and what He expects and what He judges and, you know. And I think maybe we're getting the idea that He's looking for obedience and submission. And you give Him that and you've got the world.